The scars he never explained. The young barista looked at the old man's hands and pulled back. She didn't mean to. But the scars were deep, thick, ugly. They ran across his knuckles like someone had tried to carve through bone. She handed him the coffee without a word. Her eyes stayed low. The old man didn't react. He took the cup, paid, walked to a corner table by the window. He sat alone. Like always. His name was Frank. 74 years old, gray stubble, worn jacket that didn't fit right anymore, shoulders that used to be wider. He came to this coffee shop every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Same time, same seat. No one talked to him. Most people looked away. The scars weren't just on his hands. They ran up both forearms across his neck. One side of his face had a patch of skin that looked melted, shiny, tight. People assumed things. Accident fire, maybe something worse. No one asked. Frank never explained. He sat by the window and watched the street, sipped his coffee slow. Sometimes he'd stare at his hands for a long time, like he was remembering something far away. The coffee shop was small, quiet. It sat near the edge of town where the old Veterans Hall used to be before they tore it down. Now it was just a parking lot. Frank had been coming here for 6 years. Every week, same routine. The staff knew his order, black coffee, nothing else. But they never asked his name. He never offered it. On this particular morning, the shop was busier than usual. A group of young men sat near the counter, college age, loud, confident. One of them noticed Frank. He nudged his friend. Whispered something. They looked over. Frank didn't look back. He just drank his coffee. One of the young men stood up. Walked closer. He stopped a few feet from Frank's table. Hey, old man. Frank looked up. Slowly. His eyes were pale blue, calm. The young man smiled, not friendly, just cocky. What happened to you, meth lab blow up or something? His friends laughed. Frank didn't answer. He set his cup down, folded his scarred hands on the table. The young man leaned in. You hear, mate? Frank nodded. I heard you. His voice was quiet, rough like gravel under a tire. The young man waited. But Frank didn't say anything else. Just looked at him. The silence made the young man uncomfortable. He laughed again, louder this time. Whatever, man, just saying you look like hell. He walked back to his table. His friends were still grinning. The barista looked down, embarrassed, but she didn't say anything. No one did. Frank picked up his cup. Took another sip. His hand didn't shake. 5 minutes passed. The young men got louder. Talking about a protest downtown, something about the military, about old wars, about how none of it mattered anymore. One of them said the veterans were just killers who couldn't let go. Another one agreed. Said they didn't deserve the respect people gave them. Frank kept his eyes on the window. But his jaw tightened. Just a little. The barista noticed. She'd seen that look before. Not anger. Something colder. One of the young men stood again. Walked back to Frank's table. This time he sat down. Uninvited. You served, didn't you? Frank didn't answer. The young man pointed at the scars. That's where you got those, right? Some war nobody cares about anymore. Frank's eyes stayed on the window. The young man leaned forward. My professor says guys like you just followed orders, didn't think, didn't question, just did what you were told. That's not heroic, that's just obedience. Frank's fingers tapped the table once. Slow. Then stopped. Your professor wasn't there. The young man smirked. Neither were you, probably. I'm guessing you sat on a base somewhere safe, maybe drove a truck, and now you walk around like you're some kind of hero. Frank turned his head. Looked at the young man for the first time. His eyes were calm. But there was something in them. Something the young man didn't understand. I didn't say I was a hero. The young man laughed. Yeah, because you're not. He stood up, walked back to his friends. They all left a few minutes later. Still laughing. Frank sat alone again. He looked down at his hands. Turned them over. The scars were old. But they hadn't faded. They never would. The barista came over with a rag, started wiping a nearby table. She glanced at Frank. I'm sorry about them. Frank shook his head. Don't be. She hesitated. People don't understand. Frank looked at her. No, they don't. She wanted to ask. But she didn't. Frank finished his coffee. Stood up. Left a $5 bill on the table. Same as always. He walked out into the gray morning. The air smelled like rain. He pulled his jacket tighter. Walked down the street toward the old part of town. There was a small memorial there. A stone wall with names carved into it. Frank stopped in front of it. He didn't read the names. He'd read them 1,000 times. He just stood there. Quiet. The wind picked up. He closed his eyes. And for a moment, he wasn't standing on a sidewalk anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere hot. The air thick with smoke. The sound of metal screeching. Voices screaming. The smell of burning fuel. And flesh. Frank opened his eyes. He was back. He always came back. But the smell stayed with him. It always did. He turned and walked home. His apartment was small, 1 bedroom, clean, nothing on the walls. He didn't need much. He made a sandwich, ate it standing by the sink. Then sat in his chair by the window. He stared outside until the light faded. That night he dreamed. Not of the fire. Of before. When his hands were smooth. When he was 23. When he still believed he'd come home the same. 3 days later, Frank went back to the coffee shop. Same time. Same seat. The barista smiled at him. Small, respectful. He nodded back. Everything was normal. Until the door opened. A man in his 50s walked in. He wore a faded jacket, military patches on the shoulders. He looked around. Then stopped. His eyes landed on Frank. He stared. Then walked over. Slow. Frank looked up. The man stood there for a long moment. Then he spoke. Frank Novak. Frank's expression didn't change. But something shifted in his eyes. That's me. The man's face went pale. He took a step back. Then another step forward. Sir, I didn't think. His voice cracked. I didn't think you were still alive. Frank said nothing. The man sat down. His hands were shaking. I was in Helmand, 2011. I was a Marine, second deployment. Frank nodded. Slow. The man kept talking. We got hit, IED, our vehicle flipped, fire everywhere, I was trapped, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He stopped. Swallowed hard. Someone pulled me out, dragged me through the flames, stayed with me while the medics came. I never saw his face, smoke was too thick, but I saw his hands. He looked down at Frank's scars. I saw those hands. The barista had stopped moving. She was listening. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. They told me later, said the guy who pulled me out went back 3 more times, pulled out 3 more men, got burned every time, wouldn't stop until everyone was out. Frank looked down at his coffee. You did your part. The man shook his head. No sir, you saved my life, you saved all of us. Frank didn't respond. The man leaned forward. They gave you a medal, Navy Cross. I looked it up after. You were a corpsman, you weren't even supposed to be in combat, but you were, every time. Frank's jaw tightened. I did my job. No sir, you did more than that. The man stood. He looked at Frank like he was seeing someone he'd only heard about in stories. I wanted to say thank you. I have 2 kids now, a wife. I got to see them grow up because of you. Frank nodded. Once. The man didn't know what else to say. So he just stood there. Then he left. The coffee shop was silent. The barista walked over. Slowly. Is that true? Frank looked up at her. It was a long time ago. But you never said anything. Frank shrugged. Didn't need to. She stared at him. At the scars. At the man who'd sat alone in the corner for 6 years. Why do you come here? Frank looked out the window. Because it's quiet. She wanted to say more. But she didn't. She just nodded. And walked back to the counter. Frank finished his coffee. He stood up. Left the $5 bill. Walked out. The street was empty. The sky was gray. He walked past the memorial. Didn't stop this time. Just kept walking. His hands hung at his sides. Scarred. Heavy. But steady. He'd carry them the rest of his life. And he'd never explain them. Because the men who needed to know already did. And the ones who didn't. They never would. That night the barista went home. She looked up his name. Frank Novak. Navy Corpsman. 3 Tour. Navy Cross. Purple Heart. Silver Star. She read the citations. Read the reports. There were photos. Young men in uniforms. Some smiling. Some not. Frank was in one of them. Younger, stronger. But the eyes were the same. She closed her laptop. Sat in the dark. And cried. Not because of what he did. But because of what he carried. And how invisible he'd become. Frank didn't come back to the coffee shop the next week. Or the week after. The barista noticed. She kept his usual table open anyway. Just in case. 3 weeks passed. Then a month. She started to worry. On a cold Thursday morning, she asked the regular customers if anyone had seen him. No one had. She thought about calling someone. But she didn't have a number. Didn't know where he lived. She only knew his name. And what he'd done. Another week went by. Then the door opened. Frank walked in. Slower than before. He looked thinner. His jacket hung looser on his frame. The barista's face lit up. She didn't say anything. Just started making his coffee. Frank sat in his usual spot. He looked out the window. Same as always. She brought the coffee over. Set it down gently. Missed you. Frank looked up. His eyes were tired. Was in the hospital. She froze. Are you okay? He nodded. I'm here. That was all he said. She wanted to ask more. But she knew better. She just nodded back. And left him alone. Frank drank his coffee slow. His hands shook a little now. More than before. He noticed. But he didn't stop drinking. He watched the people outside. Young families, kids, dogs on leashes. Everyone moving forward. Living their lives. Like they should. The door opened again. A woman walked in. Mid-60s, gray hair pulled back, neat clothes. She looked around. Then saw Frank. She walked straight to his table. Frank looked up. He didn't recognize her. Frank Novak. He nodded. She sat down. Her hands were folded. Tight. My son told me you were here. Frank didn't respond. She took a breath. He was one of the Marines, the ones you pulled out. He came here a few weeks ago, talked to you. Frank remembered. He's a good man. Her eyes filled with tears. He is because of you. Frank shook his head. He survived because he wanted to, I just helped. She reached across the table. Took his scarred hand in both of hers. No, you gave him a chance, you gave me my son back. Her voice broke. I came here to say thank you, I've wanted to say it for 13 years, but I didn't know your name, I didn't know where you were. Frank looked down at her hands. Small, soft. Holding his like they were something precious. He didn't pull away. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. She squeezed his hand. You gave me everything. They sat like that for a moment. Then she let go. Stood up. I won't take more of your time, I just needed you to know. Frank nodded. She walked to the door. Then stopped. Turned back. Do you have family, Mr. Novak? Frank's face didn't change. Not anymore. She nodded slowly. Then you're welcome at our table, anytime, my son would want that, so do I. She left before he could answer. Frank sat alone again. He looked down at his hand. The one she'd held. It still felt warm. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. That afternoon, Frank walked to the VA hospital. He had an appointment. Routine checkup. The doctor was young, efficient, professional. She looked at his chart. Then at him. Your heart is weaker, Mr. Novak, we talked about this last time. Frank nodded. I remember. You need to take it easy, no stress, no exertion. I don't do much. She looked at him over her glasses. I'm serious, your body has been through a lot, it's catching up. Frank didn't argue. How long? She hesitated. That's hard to say. Guess. She set the chart down. A year, maybe two, if you're careful. Frank nodded. Okay. She watched him, waiting for a reaction. There wasn't one. Do you have support, family, friends? I'm fine. She didn't believe him. But she didn't push. If you need anything, we have resources, counseling, support groups. I know. He stood up. Thank you, doctor. He left before she could say more. Outside, the sky was darker. Rain was coming. Frank walked home. Took his time. His chest felt tight. But he kept walking. When he got to his apartment, he sat in his chair. Looked out the window. The rain started. Soft at first. Then harder. He watched it run down the glass. Thought about time. How much he had. How much he'd already used. He thought about the men he'd pulled out. Wondered if they thought about him. Probably not. They'd moved on. Built lives. That's what they were supposed to do. He didn't resent it. He was glad. That night Frank didn't dream. He just slept. Deep and still. The next morning he went back to the coffee shop. Same time. Same seat. The barista smiled when she saw him. Good to see you, Frank. It was the first time she'd used his name. He noticed. Good to be here. She brought him his coffee. This time she sat down across from him. Just for a minute. Can I ask you something? Frank looked at her. Go ahead. Why don't you talk about it, what you did? Frank was quiet. He looked at his hands. Because it's not a story. She didn't understand. What do you mean? People want stories, heroes, lessons, something clean. He looked up at her. But it wasn't clean, it was smoke and blood and screaming, it was boys dying in metal boxes, it was me trying not to think, just move, just pull, just get them out. He stopped. That's not a story, that's just what happened. She looked at him. Really looked. But you saved them. I didn't save everyone. His voice was flat. Empty. I left some behind because I couldn't reach them, because the fire was too much, because I wasn't strong enough. The barista's throat tightened. But you tried. Trying doesn't bring them back. He picked up his coffee. So I don't talk about it because the ones who made it don't need to hear it, and the ones who didn't, they already know. She didn't know what to say. So she just nodded. And stood up. Frank drank his coffee. Watched the street. An older man walked by outside. He had a limp. A cane. He looked up at the coffee shop window. Saw Frank. Stopped. Stared. Then he came inside. Walked straight to Frank's table. His face was hard. Lined with age. You Frank Novak. Frank looked up. I am. The man stood there. Breathing heavy. You don't remember me. Frank studied his face. No. The man's jaw clenched. Fallujah, 2004, you were attached to our unit, we got pinned down in a building, sniper fire, mortars, we had 2 men hit, bleeding out. Frank's expression didn't change. But his hands tightened on the cup. The man kept talking. You ran across open ground, twice, brought back both of them, got shot in the process right here. He pointed at Frank's shoulder. You kept working, didn't stop until they were stable. Frank remembered. Not the man's face. But the blood. The sound of rounds hitting concrete. The weight of the bodies. They make it. The man nodded. One of them did, the other, 2 days later, infection. Frank looked down. The man leaned on his cane. I'm not here to thank you, I'm here to tell you something. Frank waited. That man who died, his name was Porter, he was my best friend, we grew up together, joined together. The man's voice got quieter. You gave him 2 more days, 2 days to talk, to say goodbye, to not die alone in the dirt. He paused. I hated you for a long time because you couldn't save him, because you saved the other guy but not him. Frank didn't react. The man exhaled. But I was wrong, you gave him dignity, you gave him a chance, that's more than he would have had. He straightened up. So I came to say I'm sorry, and to say thank you, even if it's 20 years too late. Frank looked at him. You don't need to apologize. Yeah, I do. The man turned. Walked out. Frank sat there, staring at nothing. The barista watched from behind the counter. She'd heard everything. She didn't move. Frank finished his coffee. Stood up. Left the $5 bill. Walked out into the cold. He didn't go home. He walked to the memorial. Stood in front of the stone wall. Read the names. One by one. Some he remembered. Some he didn't. But they were all there. Carved in stone. Permanent. He reached out. Touched one of the names. Porter James L. His fingers traced the letters. Cold. Hard. He pulled his hand back. And walked away. That night Frank sat in his chair. The apartment was dark. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat. And breathed. His chest hurt. But he didn't call anyone. He just waited for it to pass. It did. Eventually. He closed his eyes. And thought about the men. The ones he pulled out. The ones he didn't. The ones who lived. The ones who didn't. He thought about their faces. Most of them were gone now. Blurred by time. But the feeling wasn't. The weight. The responsibility. The guilt. It never left. Frank opened his eyes. Looked at his hands. The scars were just skin. But underneath he still felt the heat. The smoke. The grip of men too hurt to hold on. He'd carry it forever. And he'd never explain it. Because some things couldn't be explained. They could only be carried. The rain started again. Soft against the window. Frank watched it fall. And waited for morning.